I'd like to try and make sense and make some points about public opinion in Northern Ireland on the whole Brexit phenomenon, and do so using three words: division, consensus, and puzzle. It's slightly ironic and slightly entertaining to hear so much talk in today's session earlier about Britain being very deeply divided. I think when I leave Belfast and come to England, I'm leaving a deeply divided society behind and coming to a place that's not so deeply divided. Apparently, that's all gone pear-shaped and been reversed, because I have the word consensus in there. And we did hear from Liz earlier on today that Britain is appallingly, terribly, worryingly divided. And there is division. You won't be too surprised to hear about this in Northern Ireland on this issue. And as is well known, Northern Ireland's divided politically. On the one hand, you have Catholics who tend to be nationalists, tend to identify as Irish, tend to favour United Ireland. Protestants who tend to be unionist, tend to be British and favour maintenance of the union between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And this ethno-national divide, as it's often termed, maps quite closely onto whether you're a Remainer or a Leaver. For example, in the referendum, 85% of Catholics voted to remain, compared to only 40% of Protestants. And similarly, 88% of people who identify as nationalists voted to remain, compared to only 34% of people who describe themselves as unionist. There was, in addition to the ethno-national divide, differences along class and educational lines in Northern Ireland in a slightly similar way to in Britain. So people from a middle class, highly educated background are more likely to vote Remain than people from a lower class, less educated. So, for example, 80% of people with a postgraduate qualification voted to Remain, compared to less than half of those with GCSE or less. But this distinction, this class and education distinction, only works in the Protestant community. So you could say the interpretation of voting that works very well in Britain works in the British half of Northern Ireland, but not in the Catholic half. It doesn't matter what kind of Catholic you are, you vote to Remain. Class and education don't really have an effect. In terms of how opinion may have moved over time, and if you ask people a year after the referendum, how would you vote if there was another referendum, we do see some slippage towards a Remain position. Using panel data where you ask the same people at two time points, those people who voted Remain at the referendum, 90% of them say that they would vote Remain if there was a second referendum. But those who voted Leave at the referendum, a year later, less than three-quarters of them say they would vote to Leave. So quite a bit of stability, but a little bit more movement perhaps than what we heard this morning. In terms of what people's expectations are about how Brexit will affect them, first on economic matters, there isn't much optimism in Northern Ireland about whether the Northern Ireland economy will benefit from UK exit. Only 29% of people as a whole say the Northern Ireland economy will do better. It matters hugely whether you're a Remainer or a Leaver about your perceptions of the economy. Almost no Remainers think the economy will do better, but a majority of Leavers do. So your perceptions are very much coloured by where you're coming from, and there's a big difference there. Somewhat surprisingly for Northern Ireland, there is consensus on significant elements of the whole Brexit negotiation, particularly a consensus amongst people from both Protestant and Catholic community and Remainers and Leavers about the need to avoid the emergence of a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland as a function of the Brexit endgame deal. Less than a quarter of Leavers say that it's acceptable that there be a hard border, and hardly any Remainers say so. Perhaps surprisingly, we found in our most recent fielded survey in September of last year that there was some perhaps surprising flexibility amongst public opinion with respect to the possible emergence of a border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain as part of the Brexit negotiations. Approximately half of respondents said it was acceptable to have increased border controls between NI and GB if that was part of a deal backed by the UK government as part a successfully negotiated Brexit endgame. Northern Ireland does present, beyond doubt, a puzzle and a conundrum and a challenge for the Brexit negotiators. In order to leave the EU, and by which I mean actually leave and significantly leave the EU, rather than just pretend you leave, to actually really leave the thing, and not have the emergence of a north-south border, and actually not have the emergence of a border between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, is a very difficult challenge. If it was a mathematical equation, you might want to be really good at maths to solve that one. With respect to public opinion, all I would say there is that there's definitely an antipathy amongst all parties and across all swathes of public opinion, an antipathy to the re-emergence of any iteration of a hard border. That's for economic and for political symbolic reasons. And there's perhaps some flexibility on an east-west border if the UK decided to go for a differentiated exit, whereby Northern Ireland had a different exit than Britain. But that flexibility may have been reduced because that issue has become much more politicised since that fieldwork was done. But thank you for your attention.
The evidence that I have comes from Citizens' Assembly on Brexit, which gives us information about what people think about the Brexit options once they've had the chance to learn and listen and think and discuss about those options. So, quickly on what the Citizens' Assembly was, it was a group of 50 people who were randomly selected using stratification so that they reflected the composition of the UK electorate in terms of various demographic factors and also how they voted in the referendum. They met over 2 weekends in Manchester in September. First weekend, they learnt from a lot of experts and from each other about the issues that are relevant to thinking about Brexit options. Second weekend, they had the chance to deliberate in great depth among themselves and then reach a series of decisions. All of this process was supported by facilitators who made sure that they kept on track, that everyone was able to be heard and speak and be listened to fully. And the topic for the Assembly was, as it says there, what kind of Brexit members wanted. So the Assembly didn't reopen the referendum question, rather it was forward-looking, thinking about the kind of Brexit people wanted, and we focused particularly on 2 of the big issues, trade and migration. We couldn't possibly cover everything in 2 weekends, so those were the issues that we focused on. And as you know, we're funded by the ESRC, led by us at the UCL Constitution Unit. I could say much more about the process, and I'm happy to say more about the process if people have questions. But just a few quick pictures to give you the flavour. There they are at work. So a lot of the time they were talking in small groups on tables. The facilitators are the people in green T-shirts. There they are working very hard. There's a very dodgy-looking expert talking to them. And there they are, having just voted at the end and feeling very happy with themselves. But on to the results of the Assembly. So first we asked the members of the Assembly to think about policy guidelines. What kinds of things should policy on trade and migration be seeking to achieve? So we asked them to finish the sentence, UK trade policy should do what? And they had a long process of deliberating about this and then voting on the options that they came up with. And here were their top priorities. So you can see that they were concerned with the economy, with public services, living standards. They were interested in taking account of all parts of the UK. They wanted to protect workers' rights. And interestingly, the desire to avoid a hard border with Ireland came up. I think the polling evidence is still that people don't care about the border with Ireland if they're asked in an opinion survey. So it's quite striking that when they've had the chance to think about it and learn about it, whether it's hearing from the experts or hearing from Northern Ireland members present, they start thinking about that. And then UK migration policy should, and here they took quite a wide view. They didn't just think about what happens on the border. They thought about all aspects of policy that affect migration levels and the impact of migration. So investment in training, data on migrants, again the impact on public services, the economy, regional issues, and planning of public services, particularly thinking about parts of the country that experience high levels of immigration. Having thought about policy guidelines, then they voted on a series of policy options. So we started thinking about how the UK trades with the EU post-Brexit. And here the members considered 4 options: to stay in the single market as regards goods and services, to have some kind of comprehensive trade deal such as the UK government is currently pursuing, to have a more limited trade deal or no trade deal at all. you can see there what their first preferences were once they deliberated in depth and then they voted. So the preferences were spread out across the first three options. They didn't want to see no deal, but quite a lot of spread across the first three options. We were interested in seeing what do people think if it turns out that one of these options is not available. So we know that it might not be that the UK can get the kind of comprehensive deal that it wants to get. What happens if we just remove that from the table of options? And we asked people for their second and third preferences as well, so that we can see what are preferences when we eliminate options. So if a comprehensive trade deal is not an option, people wanted a limited trade deal. So they wanted some kind of trade deal, but at the same time they want the benefits of taking back control. That was a clear theme in the discussions. If we can't get any kind of bespoke trade deal, then they rejected pretty strongly the idea of no deal. They wanted the UK to stay in the single market if that is the only alternative to no deal. Then they looked at trade with countries outside the EU, which we framed very much in terms of how we relate to the customs union. So do we stay in the customs union? Do we get a bespoke deal that allows us to conduct our own international trade policy while maintaining a frictionless border? Or do we do no customs deal with the EU? And here there was a very strong first preference for getting a bespoke deal, if possible, that gives the UK the best of both worlds in many ways. But again, we considered, well, what if we can't get that? What if we can't get that kind of bespoke deal? And here, even more strikingly, the members preferred staying in the customs union over the no-deal option. So they were very concerned, particularly about the Northern Ireland border issue and the impact on exports of having border controls. Then finally, we looked at migration between the UK and the EU. We ended up with lots of options on the table as a result of the discussions. I won't go through them all, but they varied depending on the degree of preference given to EU immigrants over non-EU immigrants, and also the degree to which immigration levels remain high or are reduced. And it was quite striking that a majority preference was for maintaining free movement of labour, but also making various policy changes in order to reduce what members perceived as the negative aspects of immigration. So they saw much immigration as being good for the UK, but they wanted to tackle immigration that is not economically beneficial for the UK, which is possible within the terms of the single market. They wanted also training for UK nationals, as we saw earlier, better responsiveness for public services when there's high levels of immigration. So they had quite a nuanced view on immigration policy.
We are looking at, in this research project, is really taking a starting point also in what Liz Kendall said, and which John referred to, this idea of British society being appallingly, terribly, and worryingly divided on Britain. And I would just show you a couple of pieces of evidence that confirm that. What we just did was firstly ask people about whether they felt like a Leaver or Remainer. We asked similar questions about whether people feel Conservative, Labour, and so on. So we just replicated that. And we actually saw that quite high percentages, around 35 to 40%, are willing to say that they're Leaver, 35 to 40% are willing to say they're Remainer. And it's quite stable over time. We ran this between April and January, 2018. But that means that really a very large majority of people feel either that they identify as Leavers or Remainers. And we also find that has all sorts of implications, not only how they see the economy, how they see politics, but also how they view each other. So it's associated with these sort of stereotypes that we normally find also when it comes to very strong partisanship. And here we ask people, and this is sort of standard batteries that are used to look at polarization in public opinion. So how do you think this term describes, and then we ask Leavers to describe Remainers and so on. Do you think this hypocritical, selfish, close-minded, honest, intelligent, and open-minded? And we see that overwhelmingly Leavers like to think of other Leavers as honest, intelligent, and open-minded, and Remainers as hypocritical, selfish, and close-minded. But it's exactly the mirror image and the other way around. If anything, Remainers are slightly more likely to stereotype Leavers than vice versa, maybe because they're on the leaving side of the argument in the referendum. But certainly, and these divisions are stronger than when we replicated it for Labour and Conservative. So that means that it goes beyond the sort of political argument to stereotypes. Some of the reason of that is also that these sort of continuing divisions in society, even now, where we are quite far away from the referendum, is that people continue to see the world reflected in the way that reflects also the way in which they voted. So this is this Brexit narratives. And what we did was, not only did we ask people close-ended questions, we also had a series of open-ended questions where we just asked them to describe, what do you think the consequences of Brexit will be? And we found really kind of divisions in the sort of narratives that people use to describe it. And I'll just summarize it here for you. So what we find is that Leavers consistently talk about that this will mean control, laws, like we can make our own laws, we can control immigration and issues to do with Britain, whereas Remainers continue to speak about economics, price increases, and economic loss. So the sort of divisions we saw in the referendum campaign are still replicated in how people now look at the campaign. And I think it's relevant for when we go back to what John Curtis said earlier about the stability of attitudes, because this means once you have an identity, you also have biases associated with that identity. And that means that if I watch the news and I'm a Leaver, I'm going to think, well, it's not as bad as they said. It's actually looking pretty good. And if it is bad, it's probably because the EU are driving a hard bargain, or it probably will get better. Conversely, if I'm a Remainer, everything I see will be, oh, it's terrible, look how the pound, and so you will exaggerate or you will diminish the news you get depending. And that means that any changes, for example, economic changes, will have far less of an effect on actual public opinion. So just the final piece of evidence that I wanted to give you is also to see how that reflects. You probably can't read this, but it looks like there's lots of evidence, and then I'll talk you through it. We also ran a series of experiments, and one was about the BBC. We know it's, of course, a treasured national institution, neutral in all things. So who would you appoint as the next Director General? Is that in any way related, your views on that, is that in any way related to whether or not that person supported the Remain campaign and the Leave campaign? And we gave different people scenarios with lots of different characteristics in terms of what they had done before, whether they supported the Conservatives or Labour in a general election, what was their experience in the BBC, how old were they, what was their education, and so on. And we find that by far the most decisive factor in determining whether or not you think it should be this candidate or that candidate was who they supported in the referendum. Even a greater effect than whether or not they're Conservative and Labour, which again reflects that people really see this as a crucial factor when it comes to all sorts of things. The only thing that's similar is for Remainers, they quite care about whether this person had actually worked for the BBC before, Leavers less so. But that's just to say that when we think about public opinion and we think about why it's so stable, one of the reasons is that people now view a lot of things through the lens of how they voted in 2016.
This is very much the opposite to Alan's work. I mean, Alan's work is testing what the public would think if they learnt about these issues, if they saw all the arguments either way, when polling public opinion is often about getting samples that represent the public in all their glory, which may be based on ignorance, may be based in misinformation, is almost always based on people having far better things to do with their lives than follow the intricacies of European negotiations in great depth. So obviously we can ask people about questions about their attitudes to the customs union, about their attitudes to the single market, neither of which they understand what mean. We can ask about regulatory alignment and details of immigration policy and so on. But far too often a worry that is creating public opinion rather than measuring it. People answer that question because they're nice, helpful people, and we've asked them it, rather than because they particularly held those views to begin with. So often what the public want from Brexit is, I think, Brexit, as Theresa May would put it. They don't have a clear idea of all these details. They just want it to happen, and they want the thing that is ultimately delivered to match what their impression of what Brexit is to actually be. That caveat aside, what can we say? If we ask first, an awful lot of people don't actually think all the negotiations are critical. We asked a question earlier this month which said, basically, do you think the negotiations are going to make much difference, really? Or will this change whether Brexit is good or bad? A third of people, equally split, think that the negotiations make no difference whatsoever. They are absolutely convinced that Brexit will be good regardless, these negotiations don't matter, or Brexit will be a disaster regardless, these negotiations won't make any difference. Another third think that they are convinced, they are firm in their mind that Brexit is going to be good or bad, but they appreciate the negotiations are necessary in order to either get the best possible advantages from Brexit that are available, or in order to mitigate some of the worst possible results. That leaves about 1 in 5 people who actually think the negotiations would make the difference between Brexit being something that's horrible for Britain or Brexit being something that's good for Britain. And another 10% or so don't know. In terms of what they want from it, as you'd imagine, their hopes and fears are entirely different for people who voted Leave and people who voted Remain. Leave voters, if you ask them what they want, it's pretty much the things you'd still expect from the referendum. It is they want control over immigration, they want control over laws, they want to get back the money that Britain spends. It is when Sara put up the word cloud earlier, the words control, laws, immigration. It's exactly that. People, they were promised that they would win back control. They want something that is delivered that will give them back control over exactly the things that were discussed in the referendum. For Remain voters, the benefits they'd most like to get are actually, I expected sort of trade access and so and business access and the market access to come up top. Actually, it was freedom of movement was the thing they wanted most. Whether that was because it's direct benefit, it's something that we can all in theory do, because most of us don't export goods to Europe. It's not actually something that affects our lives directly. It might be that, but equally I pondered whether it was something that's more because it's about identity, being part of the club, being able the freedom to go and live in Europe if you want to, rather than sort of more technical economic things. It's possible. In terms of actual expectations, people still expect a muddy sort of compromise, a trade deal of some sort. Whether people will be happy with that is a different matter. For Leave voters that want control of laws and control of immigrations, they'd be happy with a Canada-type deal. Lots of them even voice approval of Brexit on WTO terms, though so they didn't when Alan did it, which is probably because they knew a lot more about it and they may have a rather optimistic view of what WTO terms are. For Remain voters, a quarter say they would have been happy in almost any sort of Brexit scenario because they don't want to leave. Most would be fairly happy with a Norway-type outcome, but obviously the government aren't currently pushing for that. So really there's nothing the government are seeking to get that would make most Remain voters happy.